Good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us for an update on Ukraine with Ambassador William Taylor. Ambassador Taylor served as the chargé d'affaires at the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv in 2019 and as the U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine from 2006 to 2009. He is currently Vice President, Europe and Russia at the U.S. Institute of Peace. And Don is going to lead the discussion first, and we will take a few questions at the end if we have time. Make sure that they are questions. Don's got a variety of questions, though, so let's listen. And thank you, Ambassador Taylor, for joining us.
Angela, thank you very much for having me. Hello, Don.
Yeah, this is always one of my favorite individuals to have to talk to. So I'm really thankful carve out this time. We wear him out here in the Peoria area. So we wanted to do this because 14 months ago we had you and Fiona Hill, and one of the best programs we ever had. People said one of the most informative. So we thought we'd like to update and see where we are. And I think, Ambassador Taylor, the first thing I think we need to address, though, is the current news and the assassination of, and I'll butcher his name, General Kirillov.
Yep.
My close on that. I'd like to get your assessment. I've written Max Boot, I think, had a opinion piece today that was it worth it? I've been reading different things that this is really good, and then others are saying, I don't know that they should be wasting their time on this. So I'd like to get your thoughts.
Yeah, Don. Well, the big picture here is that the Ukrainians, being the smaller, the fewer number of Ukrainians, the smaller economy, the smaller army, the Ukrainians have to do things to defend themselves. And again, the big picture that you remind us of, Don, is that the Russians are the ones who attacked Ukraine. It's the Russians who have committed the crime of aggression. And the Ukrainians are perfectly legitimately defending themselves. This is their right under international law, under the UN Charter, to defend themselves. So they are defending themselves in a lot of different ways. One is, of course, on the battlefield, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. Another is, in Syria. We'll probably talk about that. Another is to encourage their allies to keep up the pressure on economic sanctions. Maybe we'll have a conversation about that. The other thing they do is they shoot into Russia at military targets. And they try to disrupt the Russian aggression, the Russian invasion, the Russian troops that are coming toward and entering and doing grave damage to Ukraine, and by shooting in there at logistic centers, at oil hubs, and military targets. In contrast, Don, as you well know, to the targets that the Russians go after, which are civilian targets. The Ukrainians go after military targets, and including, in this case, getting to your question, senior generals. I apologize for this is the end of a cold, not the beginning. But yes, so General Kirillov was one of the most notorious Russian generals, responsible for the use of chemical weapons against Ukrainian soldiers. Some 4,800 times he used chemical weapons against Ukrainian soldiers, and used those chemical weapons to force the Ukrainians out of their trenches so that they could be shot at and attacked. 2,000 Ukrainian soldiers went to the hospital. 3 have died from these. So this is a perfectly legitimate military target, and it's one of a range. Excuse me. One of a range of ways that the Ukrainians are putting pressure on the Russians to stop this aggression.
Yeah, I sympathize. I told you I was in Europe and I had a cough like that at the end, so I know. The other thing that I saw, there was a pretty good article in the Guardian that was talking about this, that also he was a major mouthpiece for the propaganda and the misinformation. And it seems like, anybody that's as respected as he was, taking him out not only for the war crimes he committed, but hopefully they took out one that was efficient at misinformation. Any thoughts on that?
No, you're right. You're right. He was one of the spokespeople. He purveyed some of the worst lies about, excuse me, about the Ukrainians. He said they were using. He said that the Americans actually had released poisonous mosquitoes or some craziness. The guy was.
I read that.
So that's the guy they were dealing with, a perfectly legitimate military target.
Yeah, we don't need people like him spreading those kind of things. So we have enough problems of our own with that kind of stuff. All right, let's get into the battlefield. Can you give us an update? Let's start on the eastern front, and then we'll talk about Kursk, and then we'll kind of follow with Syria and some connections there. But on the eastern front, what are you hearing in the current status is?
Well, Don, as you said, Fiona and I were there a year and a half ago, and we put up a map at that time. And if you look at the map then and the map today, it's not much change. It's not much change. The Russians are making small changes, small movements, small gains in the east. They've been trying to take this town called Pokrovsk for about 9 months now. They've been saying that, oh, we're almost there. We're 6 kilometers away, and now we're 4 kilometers away. They still haven't taken it. They've been, again, trying for 8 or 9 months to take this one, which is an example, just the latest example of what the Russians are doing. Gradually, they are moving forward there. But if you look at the map, it's imperceptible when you look at the map of Ukraine. There is one change from the map that we showed 18 months ago, and that is the Ukrainians now hold some Russian territory. That's up in the northern. That's up around Sumy in the northern part. But other than that, Don, when you look at the map, there's not a big deal. The Russians are indeed moving forward slowly, losing anywhere from 1,000 to 1,500 soldiers a day. About a week and a half ago, they lost 2,000 soldiers. The Russians lost 2,000 soldiers in one day. So it's at great expense and not much gain, but they are making slow progress.
I guess as a history teacher and looking at military history, I have concern given how the Soviet Union ended up being victorious against the Germans, World War II, with just the massive slaughter of their own soldiers. It looks like Putin's just doing a repeat, where we're hearing, even with interviews that I see or read about from Ukrainian soldiers, they talk about how this is really getting to them, that it's just they just throw massive number of soldiers, let them get slaughtered, and then they let the special forces come in last after the Ukrainians have been dwindled down in number or just completely fatigued. I mean, it depends on how long Putin can go. But right now, I don't know if I'm Putin. I think I'm seeing this as a winning strategy. Convince me it's not.
Ask the Russian soldiers and ask the families of those Russian soldiers who know that their sons and fathers and brothers are on the front line being killed at the rate of 2,000 a day. The Russians are only recruiting about 1,000 a day, about 30,000 a month. So on net, the Russians are losing on this thing. So yeah, I think there's a big problem for Putin. I think he's facing Greek. He's got more Russians, there's no doubt.
And a few North Koreans, which I understand they've had some heavy losses here, and that the ability that Biden finally gave. And we talked about that when you and Fiona were together. Everything was always seemed a day late and a dollar short. And it seems like they're late letting them fire into Russia. But my understanding is they did at least wound a North Korean general or officer with that. Are the North Koreans just people to be expendable.
Apparently. Apparently, as you say, this is what the Soviets did, and this is what Putin has done. They have no respect for life. Which is the other thing on on the on the Ukrainian side, they do respect their soldiers' lives. Zelensky and Syrskyi, the commander, and the president, they have great respect. They are concerned about their soldiers' lives, and so they're willing to trade some space, small amount of space, for a lot of Russian casualties, but they don't want to do what the Russians are doing, is just sacrifice their soldiers in the way that the Russians are. That can't be good for Russian morale. That can't be good for morale in the army. It can't be good for morale in the families. That's a problem that Putin is going to have to deal with at some point down the line. The Ukrainians have big problems, Don, as you're saying. There's no doubt about that. And as I say, there are a lot more Russians than there are Ukrainians. So that's a problem.
Yeah, and the other concern I have, I think in the Wall Street Journal, trying to remember here, maybe just a couple of days ago, they were interviewing a 30-year-old battalion commander from Ukraine. Goes there assaulting all the time, morning, day, and night, and just talks about it's just the nonstop waves and just the toll that it takes on them, not only physically, but obviously mentally, with the breakdown. I think that's, they're replacing with green troops. One individual said in here, 90% of his forces are now just raw, not really trained well troops. So they're losing so many of their really good combat veterans.
And you're talking about the Russians losing so many of their combat veterans. They're losing so many of their people that they're also sending just untrained troops in. No, you're exactly right. On the Russian side, they have a bigger problem than the Ukrainian side.
Now, I should have told our audience that I had mentioned to you, I do not tonight have any desire to talk about the next administration. And one of the big reasons that I don't is I'm not even sure the incoming president knows what he's going to do. So the speculation to me is not worth our time on our part. But obviously, Zelensky and Putin have to factor this in. And it seems like a lot of things that are going on right now is with January 20th in mind, of seeing who can, like Kursk in particular, I see that the Russians are moving more and their best soldiers into the Kursk region, and it's seeing a level of fighting that has almost or very seldom been seen in the last 2.5 years. So I'm guessing Putin's going to try before January 20th to take the remaining part of the Kursk area back, so that's not part of negotiations.
Sure. That's what Putin has been saying. He said he wanted that done by October, Don, as you remember. Well, it wasn't. Yeah, exactly. I mean, the Ukrainians are holding on to that because first of all, it's an embarrassment to Putin. This is the first time you talked about World War II.
Yeah.
First time since World War II that the Russian homeland has been invaded. And that's an embarrassment to Putin. They didn't see it coming. He couldn't stop it. As you say, he's now kind of moving forces in there and slowly pushing the Ukrainians back. The Ukrainians are holding on. The Ukrainians know, as you've just indicated, that there is a value in holding on to Russian territory. The Ukrainians can say, look, we'll get off of your Russian territory. You get off of all of our territory. That'll be the deal.
Mm-hmm.
That would be a good deal for the Ukrainians. But yeah, they're holding on to this for negotiating purposes. Absolutely right.
I think the arguments that I see on Kursk is whether it was worth it or not, because it seems when I read, and then you may be able to give me information different, is that they had hoped Russia was going to divert more troops away from the Eastern Front than they did. They brought them in from other areas. And they've made here just in the last few days some fairly significant, for them, advancement of territory on the Eastern Front. Is this a danger, though, with sending your better troops also, as Russia has, to Kursk? Is this making it more dangerous on the Eastern Front that by January 20th, you're going to lose some vital territory there?
They haven't lost any vital territory there. They've lost a village here, a village there. As I say, you can't even see it on the map when you take a look at a map of Ukraine. So yeah, they're gradually losing a kilometer here, a couple of kilometers there. However, the diversion of troops from the Eastern Front, diversion of Russian troops from the Eastern Front up to defend the Russian homeland and around Kursk was one of the objectives. There's no doubt, and the Russians didn't do that much. They moved some, but they also had to go to the North Koreans to get soldiers to come help them in Kursk. Number one, and number two, they captured so many Russian soldiers and were able to swap them for Ukrainian prisoners of war. That was another big issue, another big objective of the Kursk operation. And then you've already said about the negotiations. The fourth thing is it was a big morale boost at the time. It was a big morale boost for the Ukrainian soldiers, for the Ukrainian people, for supporters of Ukraine around the world to see that they could move undetected a lot of troops up there and catch the Russians totally by surprise. People didn't think that was possible anymore, but the Ukrainians again showed it was possible. So there were a lot of these objectives that they've achieved. And you're right, they're losing some of the territory. I think they may have had as much as 600 or 700 square miles, and they may be down to 400 or 500 square miles at this point. But nonetheless, that's a lot of Russia that they are continuing to hold on to as they prepare for these negotiations, if they come.
Let's talk a little bit about Syria. What impact do you think that the Russians, at least at this point, they say they're negotiating with the new government, but that is a huge loss for Putin in that area. What impact do you think this might have on the Ukraine situation?
You're right, a huge loss. Putin has tried to show to the world that he's got a winning strategy and he supports these dictators around the world. So these dictators ought to be able to do what they do, what dictators do. And the Syria example shows that Putin doesn't stand. The Syria example shows that the Ukrainians have tied up this massive Russian army, this vaunted Russian army, for coming in on 3 years. I mean, I keep track of the number of days. It's 1,030 days today, 1,030 days that the Ukrainians have tied up the Russians to the degree that they couldn't support Assad. They couldn't defend their own troops. As you say, Don, they're withdrawing their forces. They're pulling out their equipment. They're consolidating around these two bases. They may not even be able to keep these two bases, an Air Force base and a naval base. They're in Syria. They're not having much luck talking to the people that they used to bomb. The Russians attacked these oppositionists mercilessly. And so now the Russians are saying, actually, they're not these terrorists that we thought they were. They're actually just opposition. No, these are people who hate the Russians, as do the Ukrainians. So I think the Russians have suffered a big loss, and it affects their ability to project power around the world, in particular towards Africa. And then your question about how it affects the war, I go back to my point earlier, which was the Ukrainians are pushing the Russians in as many different domains as they can. One, the Ukrainians helped the oppositionists in Syria get rid of Assad's forces. I mean, the Ukrainians helped them, and the opposition forces that are now forming the government know that. But that's one area. The sanctions that we keep talking about continue to have an effect, and inflation's worse now than ever. Hasn't stopped the Russians, but it has certainly overheated their economy. They've got big economic problems. So there is that, as well as the military pressure that they're doing. Plus these long range fires, plus the assassination of that general. The Syria issue, the Syria offensive by the Ukrainians and supporting the opposition, is another way to put pressure on the Russians so that they realize this is going to be key. The purpose of this pressure in all these domains on the Russians is to force them to the conclusion that they're not going to win. That they're not going to win. They're going to have to somehow cut their losses, come to the negotiating table, accept that there's going to be a Ukraine, unlike what Putin has been after all this time, where he's wanted to eliminate Ukraine. I mean, that's been his goal the entire time, is to eliminate what we know as the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian nation. And Putin cannot stand that, and he's going to lose that. Once he concludes that he's going to lose because of all this pressure in Syria, in economics, on the military ground, once he realizes that, then he will have to look for a way out.
As we get towards the end here, well, one of my last or next to last questions is going to be looking at some options that were presented in an article. And because you're right, he's got the issue of the economic conditions ahead. But then if you end a war, anyway, we're going to get into these difficult decisions if you're a dictator, basically having to decide if you're going to be there in the future. He's seen what's happened to some of these others. On the economy, The Economist had an article on the 18th that says Ukraine is winning the economic war against Russia, but it says whether that lasts depends on its ability to overcome three areas: shortages of power, men, and money. Where are we? We always know with winter coming, the Russians are always trying to, put a dent in their power structure. But where are they right now with their power structure in Ukraine?
So the Russians have attacked civilian targets over and over and over, and they have focused on the energy distribution system, in particular on the electricity side. Excuse me, both on the generation of electricity and the distribution of electricity. And I think that Economist article that you referred to, which had a great headline, you're right, that the Ukrainians are winning. I like that headline. But they went on to say exactly what you said. The Ukrainians have three big problems, first of which is power. And they're probably down a half from certainly a half of their kind of oil and gas generated. I think they're still running their nuclear power plants, the ones that are still operating, even at a lower power. But the Russians have gone after these civilian targets. Mainly, the reason that the Economist points out this is so important is the power sector, the electricity sector, does fuel, if you will, the economy, and so the economy is also down a half. But it tries to affect the morale of the Ukrainians. I mean, as you say, winter's coming. Winter basically here. I'm talking to good friends in Ukraine, and winter is here. You see the pictures. There's snow on the ground. And when they are forced, I was talking to a lady today in Lutsk, not even on the front line, not even close to the front line, and she was talking about how the power goes out on a regular basis. She's actually a professor. She teaches her class still in person in class, but they have to several times a day. Sometimes they have to go into the air raid shelters down below, and often without electricity for exactly the reason we're talking about. This is all to say, Don, that the Russians attacking the electricity generation sector is a big problem. Now, the Ukrainians have been dealing with this, and they're importing. Again, the Economist made a good point. They're importing more than they have. In the past, they've got generators, mobile generators. They are saving electricity, saving power in remarkable ways, finding ways that, to use renewables and to conserve. When necessity's there, they do it. So that's there, but it's undoubtedly a big problem that they're going to have to deal with.
I would recommend the article because, as you said, it dealt with a farmer who's had to change different ways to try to become profitable, but I think he's into cheese now. But he says that's a little difficult when you don't have 12 hours of power. So yes, a lot of issues. I I like to emphasize the point you made. So far, their creativeness and their ingenuity has really been remarkable. But now I want to take you, when we're talking about manpower, into the population. And CSIS, the Center for Strategic International Studies, I've just now ran across at a futures lab that they've got all kinds of articles. They talk about the importance of farming in future negotiations and stuff. So, still having a farm, I'm concerned. But one of their articles was talking about that in 2000, Ukraine had 50 million, and the World Health Organization believes by 2050 they'll be at 32 million. A loss of population. They also mentioned that Russia is having a same issue. The article's argument is that one of the reason that maybe Putin goes into these places also is it's one way you up your population by taking over countries and Georgia and so on and Ukraine and just saying, well, yeah, they're Russian speaking and ethnic, but we'll just keep moving and add to our population. What I'm leading to is I think here in the United States, we're always a little bit surprised about the draft age and the debate that was from, what was it, 27 to 25, I believe.
Right. That's right.
But the article addressed that one reason is they are worried about the demography there and having babies and keeping their population from dying out with that. Any observations on that as a driver of policy in Ukraine?
Yeah. So the Ukrainians understand all too well how important it is to have enough soldiers defending them from the Russians. They understand that. And they're dealing with it in a lot of ingenious ways, as you've pointed out, Don. There are a lot of people, a lot of Americans, CSIS, but also a lot of generals in the Pentagon who say, oh, the Ukrainians ought to do this and that on the draft, draft 18 to 24-year-olds. Why aren't they drafting these up? Those, as we all know, those decisions about the draft in this country and who to draft and who not to draft, those are very political, important decisions that Americans have to make on our case and Ukrainians have to make in their case. They know they are living with the threat of the Russians right in their country, on their soil. They know they need soldiers. They're looking for soldiers in a lot of different ways, and they're looking to make it more effective, and they are looking to make the draft more effective. I think we just, we provide them with the material, with the weapons, with the ammunition needed, and they need to figure out where they're going to get the soldiers. Because exactly what you say, Don, they've got other things to be concerned about as well. They want to maintain the ability for there to be a Ukraine going into the next century. They want to be sure that they have the ability to have a nation. And they can figure this out. You're exactly right to point out that Putin is in a long line of Russian and Soviet and Russian again leaders, dictators, czars that have for 300 years expanded. I mean, this is an imperial empire. And it's for the reasons that you said. They need soldiers. They want land. And they keep taking it. They keep taking it as long as they can. And until someone stops them, like the Ukrainians have for the past 1,030 days, until someone stops them, they'll keep going. They will keep going. The Ukrainians understand that. And they've got a manpower problem. They got a soldier problem. And they'll deal with it. What we need to do is continue to provide them with the weapons and the finances to be able to move in the direction that we want them to go. And they're doing an amazing job of it. So let's let's keep that support coming.
Okay. Yeah, it was an interesting area to me because I hadn't really heard it talked about very much. It kind of helps for those of us that are used to an 18 draft age. It makes much more sense. Also, that's kind of a driving of their innovative group. Although you can be innovative at any age, but they're needing those workers and those innovators to help get new weapons and adjusting. So,
No, Don, you're exactly right. And you make the good point, trying to compare our situation with theirs. We've got what, 350, nearly 350 million people. So if we think about how much we have in our army, or if we were talking about a draft, compare that to the Ukrainians, who, as you say, they probably have 35 million people at this point, at best. And a lot of those may be, in Germany and in Poland, at least the women. So when you're looking at, say, 30 million people, and compared to 350 million people, we can afford to take a small portion of that 18 to 25-year-old slice. We can take a very small portion of that and have more soldiers than we need. They can't. If they've got 30 million, to take a slice out of that is a big chunk of their population. It's all to say that they can figure this out, and we should give them what we have that they need, and then they can train these soldiers and put it on the equipment.
all right. Well, let's get into the civilian population in Ukraine. The Economist on November 20th said most Ukrainians now want an end to the war. It talks about a Gallup poll in which 52% of Ukrainians now support negotiation to end the war as soon as possible. The share of those, and that was up from 27% a year ago. And then they said those determined to fight until victory has dropped from 63% to 38%. And even Zelensky, we're first really starting to hear him talk about that it's going to have to be a negotiation to end it, which I think he had always been preaching. We're going to recover all of our ground. What are you for the people that you know? Can you tell us about any shift of attitude and where you think the Ukrainian people are in their attitude right now?
Well, I'll tell you one thing that hasn't shifted, and that article and several other articles have made this point. Yeah, there's no people, there's no one in the world that wants this war to end more than the Ukrainians. That's obvious. That's clear. They want this war to end. The other thing that hasn't changed is that they don't want to give up land. There's still overwhelming support for, yes, I mean, there's increasing support for negotiations. That's right, Don. Excuse me. But there's still very strong, like 80% say we're not going to give up territory. Well, as you say, they're not going to give up territory. And what Zelensky has said is that, number one, we're not going to give up territory. We're never going to give up claim to all of our internationally recognized borders from 1991. We're not going to give up claim to it, legal claim to it. We may have to temporarily accede. We don't like this. Ukrainians really hate this idea, but they may have to accept that they're not going to control 20% of their territory. That's what the Russians now occupy. They're coming to, and you're right. Zelensky has said under one big condition, we're going to come to, under one big condition, he is very reluctantly willing to sit down and have conversations and have negotiations that might leave temporarily that 20% under Russian control. The big condition, the only way he is willing to sit down for these negotiations is if NATO invites him to join the alliance. Zelensky needs some way to be sure that if he agrees to a ceasefire, if he agrees not to try to take back that last 20% that's now occupied by the Russians, if he agrees not to try to take that back, he needs some guarantee, not just a promise, not just a piece of paper. He needs some guarantee that the Russians are not going to take that ceasefire, build back up. They're hurting right now. The Russians are hurting right now for all the reasons that we talked about. They're losing 2,000 men a day. But if they get a ceasefire, they can build back up. And what Zelensky wants, what he has to have, is some guarantee that that ceasefire will not lead to the Russians invading again. He cannot that, so he won't agree to something without that kind of guarantee. The best guarantee of his security, of Ukraine's security, is membership in NATO, and that's what he's asking for in order to sit down and have conversations about negotiations.
Yeah, that was an Economist article on November 28th. With I think the headline was "How to Make a Success of Peace Talks with Putin. The Key is Robust Security Guarantees for Ukrainians."
Yep.
Now, I've also seen that there's been some discussion of as soon as an agreement has been reached, some of the European countries sending their forces into Ukraine as defense forces. What are you hearing?
Sure, I am hearing that. So I was in Montreal, 3 weeks ago. There was a NATO Parliamentary Assembly, so parliamentarians from all over NATO, and several parliamentarians from European countries, NATO nations, said exactly that they are now thinking seriously about how to enforce a ceasefire, which is what Zelensky is asking for, and what you just said that Economist article talked about as well. How to enforce a ceasefire, how to be sure that a ceasefire does not lead to a violation of ceasefire where the Russians would just come across and try to take more territory. And so the Europeans are thinking about providing forces, putting forces there to be sure that the Russians know that they would be opposed if they tried to do that again. And several of these parliamentarians, both in the big conversation in the plenary that I had, talking about NATO, by the way, but also afterwards, came up to me and said, we're really thinking about it, and we would need to know that the Americans would somehow support. So that would be an important part. So this all goes back, if we're talking about Europeans doing this kind of security guarantee in Ukraine, and the Americans supporting somehow, that's NATO. I mean, that's NATO. That is what NATO does, and so that's why Zelensky is asking for that kind of support. But that kind of support would include, Don, you're exactly right. The French have talked about this. The Poles are not eager to do it. The Brits have talked about this. Of course, the Baltic states and the new states of new NATO nations in Finland and Sweden. There's a lot of support, a lot of discussion of this idea. But the real question is how to end this war in a way that doesn't start it up again.
Also in that article, it talked about what Putin has said or what I guess his demands are, that the West should lift sanctions, that Ukraine should renounce NATO membership, that it be demilitarized, and declare itself formally neutral, denazify itself. That's always a gem. In other words, get rid of their leaders and protect the rights of Russian speakers. Well, we know Ukraine's not going to and I know we're just guessing, trying to read Putin's mind, but what do you think he would be willing to give up? Just guessing.
John, no one knows what's in his head. I mean, that list of demands that you just read out, that you just went through, is so ludicrous. Yeah. Makes no sense. I mean, the Ukrainians are going to declare their neutrality. The Ukrainians are going to allow the Russians to stay in their territory. The Ukrainians are going to get rid of their Jewish leader, by the way.
Yes.
So the Ukraine, it's just ludicrous. So you can't take anything that he says seriously. What you have to do is you have to push him. You have to push him militarily, economically, diplomatically, in Syria, with attacks on the homeland. You have to push him. And once he realizes that he can't get these demands make no sense. then he'll look for something that will allow the Ukrainians to live in peace, and then the NATO alliance, ideally with Ukraine as a member, can live side by side with the Russians. That's a better deal for the Russians. He won't admit this, but the Russian people would much rather have a nation on their borders that's not about to attack them. So what Russia has done with this invasion has created a incredibly hostile, angry nation right on its borders. It didn't used to have that. There used to be decent relations between the Ukrainians and the Russians. When I was there the first time in 2006, 2009, you know, they were like cousins and brothers and business partners. Now the Ukrainian nation is unified against the Russians, and they are angry and they are hostile. It's not too strong to say they hate the Russians. And so the Russians might well be better off if the Ukrainians were in NATO. The Russians could be better off if the Ukrainians were constrained by being in a defensive alliance so that they couldn't attack Russians out of this anger that the Russians have created. This is all to say that I don't know, and frankly, Don, I don't much care what Putin says about these things because we don't know what's in his head. So what we do know is how we can support the Ukrainians and how we can get them to be able to live, to be a sovereign nation and make their own decisions.
Okay, I have a couple more things, but we won't have time tonight, but a couple of things that I've read about the dilemma, and you and I, before we started the program, talked about this a little bit. The problem is with Putin, with his economy the way it is, if you demilitarize and cut down, then he's got to worry about his economy. Full-blown military, at least it extends out for a longer period of time. I mean, there's some tough judgments of what would happen after a negotiated settlement that I think is a dilemma he's put himself into, remarkably there. But let's get into very quickly the neighbors, and then I wanted to talk to you just a little bit about Telegram. Not Belarus, but Hungary, Slovakia, and Romania. Hungary with Orban is, oh, we love Putin. And so now you've got a neighbor that badmouths NATO, the EU. Slovakia looks like it might be making a right turn. And then you and I talked about Romania, where that election has been put on hold. But that candidate has said that NATO is the weakest alliance in the world. He's, again, more pro-Russia. And Romania is some really key bases. I guess as an observer, how concerned should I be about this, what we're kind of seeing as a little more rightward and a little more pro-Putin swing in Europe, but especially in those countries?
Yeah, we should be concerned. Surely. I mean, Orban's a problem. Slovakia is a problem. Romania might be, not yet. Yeah, that's a problem. They've been able to get around that, however. Now, this is not a new problem. We've had this Orban problem for a long time. And the Europeans have found ways to get around that Orban problem. They invite him out of the room when they make decisions. They've leaned on him hard to make this. So, yeah, it's a problem. And if the Slovaks think that their alliance, the alliance that they're a member of, doesn't do it, they can leave. If they don't want to be supported by the NATO alliance, fine. But the nations who are supportive of their own security and of the security of the other members, those are still very strong. And the Poles, even though they don't want to send their soldiers into Ukraine, the Poles are as strong as any. And they and the Germans and the French strong support. We talk about political trends. In Germany, the new chancellor is likely to be a stronger supporter of Ukraine than the current chancellor. So that's that's be going in the right direction on this thing. So and we got a strong supporter in Italy of all places. And Meloni she's great on Ukraine. All to say that the big nations in the alliance, the ones that matter, continue to support. And yes, the Orbans and the Slovakias and they're an irritant, but they have not been able to stop the strong support by the EU as well as the rest of NATO for Ukraine, and I imagine that will continue.
Okay. Romania worries me, just especially for the grain sales, and it's some key bases there. I just worry it's even getting this close. You wish that it wasn't even. Poor Zelensky, as we said, it's like he just needs more headaches to have to worry about. I wanted to talk to you just to finish up about Telegram. When I was in Cuba last December leading a group, our tour director was from Russia, and then she married a Cuban man whose mother was American and actually the head of the CBS News Bureau down there at the time. So it was an interesting mix. But oh yeah, we all use Telegram. So aren't you on Telegram? And so I kind of followed it more closely and how it's used so extensively by the Ukrainian soldiers. But again, the New York Times on December 9th talked about that looks like it's a Russian security problem. Have you heard a buzz on it? The article just said they're trying to disentangle themselves from Telegram.
I imagine they are. I've not done. I don't know that. I know that there are a lot of people on Telegram. I think the Russians use it more than the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians, of course, use Starlink. But Telegram is used by a lot of the population. They're exact. By the way, I've seen there have been occasionally these chat pieces that I don't know if you're going to get to some of these, Don, or not. But there was one that talked about how if she were or he were, whoever it was, Russian, he or she would never let the Ukrainians into NATO. Well, it turns out that the Russians don't get a voice. It turns out that decision is between Ukraine applying and the NATO alliance accepting or not. But the Russians don't get a vote. So for them to say they won't accept it, well, that's not something they can say. They can do other things, there's no doubt. And we need to be strong in opposing what the Russians can do. But they don't get a vote on. Let's just be clear. They don't get a vote on whether Ukraine joins NATO.
The reason I'm so interested in the social media is because I don't use it as much, but there's a huge part of our population in the world that does use it, and especially a lot of the extremist groups, and obviously many younger people. And for the soldiers, these are lifelines. So I think this is an area that is going to give all of us fits because they're going to want to keep using this stuff for information. It may be the only thing that keeps some of the Ukrainian soldiers sane is, some, ability to respond back to family and friends. But we've always got somebody wanting to exploit everything, don't we?
You're right.
Okay, and I told you I would give you a last opportunity to share anything that you think our audience might be very interested in that I haven't asked you.
So, Don, I'm glad to do that. I also thought there might be an opportunity for anybody else on the screen to ask questions, but
they're going to be that's coming up. But I was going to give you a shot. So yes,
no. Let's go straight to them.
Let's go straight to questions. So Angela, if you're ready.
Yeah, well, there were a couple really good ones in the chat. Mark has asked about access to the Black Sea. So if Ukraine is cut off and with Ukrainian troops in Transnistria on the Romanian side of Ukraine and Putin's ambition to control the Black Sea, is that going to be a death knell for Ukraine if they don't have access for imports and exports through the sea?
This is a great question. And it turns out that Ukraine, without a navy, Angela, I don't know who it was, Mark, you said it was Mark who asked this question, without a navy, has pushed the Russians out of the western half of the Black Sea. thus opening up export routes. So the Ukrainians are able to export their grain through the Black Sea, through Turkey, through the Bosphorus. And the Russians have been pushed. The Russians can't even have their Black Sea fleet in Sevastopol, in occupied Crimea. Why? Because the Ukrainians have used, they're so clever and they're so competent with their, not only their missiles, but their drones, their sea drones, where they have damaged an incredible number of the Black Sea fleet vessels, that the Russians have had to pull those ships out of Sevastopol and move them all the way to the eastern part of the Black Sea, opening up the sea lanes. So I think this is, Mark's exactly right to be concerned, to ask the right question about whether or not the Ukrainians can export. Well, they can. And it's because they have been able to push the Russians out of that area.
And an earlier question asked about leadership in the military, the churn in the military. Both in Russia and in Ukraine, we've seen some turnover of military leadership. Should we be concerned about Ukraine? We're probably less concerned about Russia, but does that signal a weakness in Ukraine that they're turning over their leadership?
No, leadership turns over all the time. I mean, Americans know about changing leaders, changing military leaders. We can think of MacArthur as an example. So that does happen. Of course it does. And again, this is one that we will never understand as well as the Ukrainians. I mean, the Ukrainians are the ones who are going to figure that out. But you're right to point out that the Russians have a big time problem with this. The Russians, as we remember, had one of their main commanders of the Wagner group who mutinied. You know, he pulled out of Ukraine. Prigozhin pulled his troops, the Wagner group, out of Ukraine and marched on Rostov, one of the military headquarters right down there in that neck of the woods. And no one stopped him. There was no Russian military that stopped him. So Prigozhin kept on going. He was halfway to Moscow before he looked around. He was hoping somebody would join him, and they didn't. But the point is, the Russians, you're exactly right, Angela. The Russians have a big problem in their chain of command, not least because they've invaded their neighbor. The Ukrainians know why they're fighting. The Ukrainians know that if they lose, there's no Ukraine. The Russians have to be told, remind us again why we're invading Ukraine. And Putin can say, well, because I want to be a great Russian leader. Not good enough. So the Russians have a big problem. The Ukrainians know why they're fighting.
Another question early on was about the population. So when the war started, a lot of Russians fled Russia, young men, so that they would not be obligated to fight in the military. But a lot of Ukrainians also have fled their country. So let me turn it into another question about conscription. So Russia is not conscripting. That's probably what Putin needs to do, but he is not doing a massive conscription. Instead, he has fighters from all over the world, the allies of Russia, from Africa, Middle East, and now North Korea. But Ukraine is also actually instituting conscription, the draft. And for young men of military age, which, help me out, I think is older than 26.
25.
25?
25 now. They lowered it 2 years. Yeah.
Yeah, if they are, for example, they were students in the United States when the war erupted and their student visas have expired. When they go to apply for new visas, they've been told that their visa is not going to be renewed and they're being sent home. Does this, on either side, for Russians or for Ukrainians, is this a morale killer? Or do people feel the urge, the need to defend their country, whichever
The Ukrainians feel the need. The Ukrainians feel the need to defend their country. Oh yeah, I mean, there's no doubt. If they don't, there's no Ukraine. So there's that strong motivation. When the Russians did partially mobilize, they had a partial draft early on, and you're right. 1 million Russians left, mostly men. when the Russians invaded, there are several million Ukrainians left, mostly women and children, and they went to Poland and Germany, and so yeah, and that's what you saw, and what the Russians felt was that drain of men, not just because they needed them as soldiers, they needed them in their tech companies, they needed them in their industry. The Russian labor shortage is one of the big drivers of the problems that the Russians are having in their economy that Don talked about earlier. So yeah, the manpower, the number of soldiers is a problem on both sides. You're absolutely right.
So, in a separate message sent to me, well, I'll ask my question first. So, Ukraine versus Russia in terms of size of economy, size of military, size of well, everything. Ukraine is a third of the size of Russia, and so they're punching well above their weight, and they're doing it quite well. Can you credit it entirely to the existential threat, or is it because of the support of the EU and the United States?
Absolutely, it's all of the above. Of course, it's all the above. The Ukrainians would not have been able to defend themselves and stop the Russians for 1,030 days if it had not been for the Americans and the Europeans supporting, both on the weapons side, on the training side, on the equipment side, on the ammunition, on the financial support. They wouldn't be there. I mean, they'd be fighting in the forests. A guerrilla warfare is what they would be doing now if they didn't have the Americans and the Europeans. But they do have the Americans and the Europeans, and they do have this strong motivation, and they do have the ability to innovate. The Russians do too, and the Russians are trying to catch up, and sometimes the Russians will even surpass. And then the Ukrainians innovate and they surpass. But the Ukrainians have a drive, an innovation. They also have much more horizontal society. The Russians have a vertical society. It's top down. The Ukrainians are so strong because they've got the whole of the society working for the support of the military, support of the country. And it's the civil society, it's the doctors, it's the women at home that are making camouflage nets. It's incredible support from all of the society, including those young men in school in the United States or in Great Britain. They're going home. They're going home. They're going home to fight. Sometimes they're drafted, sometimes their visa are not extended, but they're going home. And because they know that, again, if the Russians win, there's no Ukraine.
So, the one that was sent to me separately was an add-on to Don's question about social media, because Ukraine has taken, I don't know that they do the same for Ukrainian dead soldiers in Russia, but Ukraine will take photos of bodies that are recovered on the battlefield and put them on social media, trying to identify who they are. And a lot of mothers have figured out, or girlfriends or wives have figured out that their man has died in battle. Is that a social media victory for Ukraine, or is that an opportunity? What do you think about that? And does Russia do the same? I have not seen anything myself, but maybe there is something on the other side of that.
I don't know this part of it, Angela. What I do know is that the Russians go to great lengths to avoid any information about dead soldiers.
Yeah.
But you're right. The Ukrainians do try to let families know. What the Russians just talk about dead soldiers on the Russian side. They have used financial incentives to get young men to volunteer. The signing bonus in Russia is like $61,000. That's an incredible amount of money in Russia. I mean, it's not a bad amount of money here, but $61,000 just to sign up. And then there's also a very big death payment And so families who've lost soldiers, they get paid a lot of money, to the extent that families are now kind of pushing their men to go volunteer, go to the front. So it's a distorted. War is just horrible. It goes back to the source of this war, which is the Russian invasion.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to say that was the talk in Cuba, where a lot of Cubans now are over there in the fight. And like I said, the death benefits with conditions so bad in Cuba right now, it's just made it very enticing. But they say they're going to be in support. They don't necessarily tell them they're going to be on the front line combat. And once they're there, you're just kind of, you don't really talk back to the Russians. So
if you talk back or turn back, you get shot.
Okay, before we run out of time here, I do want to bring up one final point that we've learned from our trying to supply Ukraine and ammunition. And there have been like a couple of new articles coming out on that as well here in the last few days, is that we realize that the United States is not prepared to fight a war at all. We don't have enough TNT. We can't keep up to supply. If we were in a war, we wouldn't be able to supply our own, as you have to ratchet up. And I know Europe is aware of that. And the talk of their leaders is we've got to gear up our war industry so that we're ready for anything. But the side on that is everybody's in debt. And so there's money going in that. I think this is going to be a political nightmare, but it's also a major national security nightmare. So any observations, Ambassador?
Yeah, it's certainly true that we have drawn down our stocks of weapons and ammunition. And in order to build those stocks back up, we need to and are putting a lot of money into the defense industrial base. That we're talking about companies that make ammunition and that make tanks and armored personnel carriers. We've put a lot of money into replacing those weapons that we have provided to the Ukrainians so that they can stop the Russians in Ukraine instead of allowing the Russians to go into Europe. So, but that industrial base has been allowed to draw down, to weaken. And one of the things that this war has shown, the Ukrainians stopping the Russians for 1,030 days, I just keep saying that, is that we have spent a lot of money, put a lot of money into our defense industrial base for the reason that you said, Don. If we ever get into a war like this, we're going to need that support. We're going to need that capacity. We're going to need that capability to manufacture the weapons and the ammunition, the explosives that you talk about. And so we are now coming to grips with that. We're starting slowly to build that back up. And that needs to happen over a longer period of time.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Taylor. This has been a bit depressing, but a very good update on what's going on in Ukraine. And we hope for better times in the new year. On behalf of the Peoria Area World Affairs Council, thank you very much, Don, for leading a great conversation, and Ambassador Taylor. Remember, folks, we have our book club on the 4th Sunday of January. We're going to read Bob Woodward's book, War. And on January 31st, we will have a presentation with the young entrepreneurs from Brazil at Peoria Next at 10:30 a.m. So thank you all for joining us this evening. Thank you, Ambassador Taylor. Happy holidays. Happy New Year, everybody.
Ambassador Taylor,
thank you. And Don, thank you all very much. Great to be here again. I'd love to join you sometime again soon.
Ambassador Taylor, I have to ask you very quickly, though, the uniform over your shoulder. I aimed to ask you earlier.
Ukrainian captain's uniform. A friend of mine in the Army gave it to me. You can't see it, but there's a name tag there on that Ukrainian military uniform. It says Taylor. And so it was a good gift.
All right. And please, you go to Ukraine again, let me be a stowaway with you, please.
I would love to have you, Don. I'll be there next month, I believe.
I'll be in touch. All right,
very good.
Thank you so much.
Have a great
Thanks,
holiday.
everyone.
Thank you all.
Good night, everyone.
Good night,
Thank you.
everyone.